Welcome to Short and to the Point, a podcast from the Comeback in Awful Announcing. Here's your host, Jessica Kleinschmidt.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Short and to the Point on Awful Announcing and the Comeback. Jessica Kleinschmidt here. Guess what, guys? The World Series is over. I'm not going to say I'm excited about it because y'all know how much I love baseball, but we're going to shift some gears because we're in the thick of the NFL season. And I couldn't think of a better guest besides Marcas Grant of NFL Network, because I bet you $1 bajillion if you are watching this now or listening to this now, you're probably a fantasy football team owner. And congratulations on that. I'm sure you have a big ego. And I'm sure you went into your draft saying, my lineup is going to beat everybody. But then by week 3, week 4, all the injuries occurred. Or if you're an Aaron Rodgers owner, the first 75 seconds of the season. So I wanted to pick his brain about all things fantasy because let's face it, we're all a fantasy football expert. Me personally, I once beat my dad and my little brother in a league where I auto drafted. So I got very lucky and I thought I was the best thing in the world. So I considered myself a fantasy football expert. Boy, was I humbled. So Marcas walks us through what it's like to own a fantasy team, how he introduces himself, and what it's like to have your hands in different parts of the fantasy football world. So without further ado, here is my interview with NFL Network's Marcas Grant. All right, Marcas joins me. Marcas, thanks for stopping by. Short and to the point. Good to have you here.
Appreciate the invitation. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, so there's a lot that I want to go over, and because I've known you for so many years, as I was prepping for this, I'm like, oh, I have to ask about this. I have to ask about that. And I'm so excited. But before we get all into it, when you introduce yourself to somebody, do you refer to yourself as a fantasy football expert or a fantasy football analyst? And you and I kind of talked about this before we pressed record. How do people respond to your title?
I don't even know how do I introduce myself? I like people like, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I talk about fantasy football for the NFL. So I've dumbed it down even more. Like I don't even give myself a fancy title. I'm not a sandwich artist. I just work at Subway. That's sort of how it works. Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, so that's sort of how I talk about it. I think for the most part, people are like, oh, that's cool. And I think there's sort of this thought or this emotion of, wow, you actually get paid for that, which, funny story. Because I remember like years ago, I've been at the NFL for 12 years now.
Yeah.
But when I first got hired, I remember I called my dad and was just like, hey, so I'm going to be, writing about fantasy football at the NFL. His first question was, what's fantasy football? And I had to kind of explain the basics of that to him. And then I explained what I did. That, hey, look, I'm the one who's giving people advice on who to start and sit and add and whatever. And he got real quiet for a second. And he's like, they're going to pay you for that, huh? I was like, yeah, man, I'm just as surprised as you are. So, I mean, I think a lot of people look at it as like, hey, that's kind of cool. It seems like a lot of fun. It seems like a lot of people's dream jobs. And I guess it is, but it's, I never planned on this as being a career. Like I said, I've been here 12 years, 13 seasons. I never anticipated that I would have this as a career or that this would be the longest I've ever been at one job in my life.
Well, and I think I heard you were on a podcast with Bucky and you said the job kind of found you, which was really cool. Walk me through that and how that transpired.
Yeah, I had been in radio for a long time in various forms and was before this working for what was then Sporting News Radio. I think they've gone through several name changes and iterations, but the company that I worked for got sold. The owner wanted to move up operations to Houston, and I didn't really want to move to Houston. I'm from California, wanted to stay out here, so I figured out a way to just sort of make it work. And a former coworker suggested I apply for jobs at the NFL, that they're always looking for people seasonally. So I literally went to like NFL.com/jobs or careers or whatever the link is for it. Applied for 5 or 6 things, most of which I was not qualified for. And kind of forgot about it. This was 2011 and the lockout was happening in the NFL. I applied for stuff. We didn't know if there was going to be a season. I sort of forgot about it. In the interim, I went on and I actually interviewed for a lot of things. I don't know if I've told you this part, but fun story. I was a finalist for the very first edition of the MLB Fan Cave that lasted for I think 3 seasons. I was a finalist. They flew me out to beautiful Piscataway, New Jersey, for the auditions there. I get home, find out like a week or two later that they actually chose some other people for it. Was kind of bummed about it, but then
Right.
not long after, I turn on ESPN. I see that the NFL lockout is over. I get a phone call from the guy who was the head of fantasy at that time and asked me if I wanted to have the job. Actually, I should back up because I did interview. He called and asked if I wanted to interview, and I was like, "Does it pay?" And he's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Sure." So then the day the lockout ended, they called up and they offered me the gig. And, I started the first year as sort of a glorified copy editor. They would let me write an occasional blog post or two. I got, I think, 1 or 2 guest spots on the podcast at the time. But I was seasonal. I worked for 7 months out of the year. I think I started in August. They sent me off to the wilderness in March. And I had to kind of fend for myself for 5 months before I was able to come back. And that was my life for the first 2 seasons at the NFL. And now here I am, fortunate more than a decade later to still be there doing stuff.
Amazing. And especially in a job where it's, these jobs you don't stick around for a while. So that's great. And it's kind of interesting because you have the copy editing background and the radio background. I feel like if you kind of create a marriage between the two of them, you can create what you have now. So what have both of those backgrounds helped you in what you're doing now? Because it's I know you're on TV and stuff, but there's a digital aspect to it as well.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think because now when you're doing any sort of digital media or any kind of media, I hate the phrase content creation because it just sounds so cheap or whatever.
I feel like I'm doing a TikTok dance every time I say content creator.
Right, exactly. Right. So, but I mean, for whatever we're calling this job that you and I are doing, it really does pay to do as many different things as you can. And so, I'm fortunate enough to be on TV. People think I don't suck at that, so that's cool. But also, I mean, this job started for me as more of a writing-based job and sort of morphed from there into podcasting, which, is maybe the closest thing to radio you can do without actually doing radio. And then from there has morphed more into television. So I just think it's the ability to kind of do a lot of different things. And you come across people who are good at 1 or 2 of them, and every once in a while you run into somebody who really excels at all 3 of those things. But I do think just having all of those backgrounds has really served me well because it's given me a lot of different avenues to find jobs. And as you mentioned, I've found one that's allowed me to sort of merge all 3 of those things into one.
And when it comes to that, it's a theme that I've noticed on this podcast. And during the infancy of my career, I was kind of told you should just concentrate on one thing, whether it was sidelines or podcasting or reporting. And now I feel like we're kind of embracing somebody who is a 5-tool player. Would you believe that? Because you've been in the industry long enough where you can kind of analyze that.
I do believe that. I think the cynical part of me believes it because large companies don't want to have to pay multiple people.
Yeah.
That they want to be able to hire somebody that can do a lot of things. I mean, that is sort of the age we are in, especially when it comes to media, is that if companies can streamline their bottom line, that's what they're going to do. So, that is, maybe a cynical way to look at it. But I also just think that it does. It's like anything, right? Like playing a sport, whether it's football or baseball, like the more you can do, the more opportunities you're going to have in your career. I mean, look, you may not become a superstar by being a utility player, but you're always going to have a job. You're always going to have an opportunity because you can offer so many different things to a company. And I think even if you decide that, you want to go out and do something different, I mean, I think we've seen so many people branch out and start their own platforms. I know, especially in the fantasy sports space, a lot of people going off and creating their own platforms. The ability to write, to podcast, to be on camera, I think goes a long way because that allows you to engage with people in so many more things. Whether if somebody wants to read an article, you can provide that for them. If they want to listen to a podcast, they can do that. If they just want to watch, a short video, whether it's YouTube or what have you, you offer that as well. So I do think we have reached the point where the more you can do, use an old, Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots phrase, the more you can do, the better off you're going to be over the long term.
it just, and it's just refreshing to hear, because I, like, the beginning of my career, I was told just concentrate on one thing, and as time goes on, it's like, no, embrace everything else. So it's just weird to hear that. And kind of on that note, the overview of the fantasy realm has changed so much over the years. And at the beginning, it was just fantasy football, period. And obviously DFS has become a thing. Sports betting has opened it up a bunch. What are your thoughts on the fantasy football world and how much it's changed, and you having to transition along the way?
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember having been in this job maybe a couple of years. So I started in 2011. So this might have been 2013, 2014.
I forget that it's not 2011
I
anymore.
know, right? Like that was a
How much
long
was
time
that,
ago.
Marcus? Like the
Right?
80s,
Like,
not that long ago either.
right? Exactly. But I remember like 2013, 2014, we went to a conference, a trade show, basically in Chicago for the fantasy, what was then the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. I think they've changed their name since then, but um, I remember it was, in a ballroom at like the Chicago Hilton or something like that, and being amazed way back then that they filled this place up. I mean, there were probably, several hundred people there, all trying to, either network or sell products or that sort of thing. It blew me away at the time that many people were into it, because I certainly didn't think that, the analyst side of it was that big. I knew people played. I played socially. I mean, it was a thing that I didn't play at a high level. I played because it was a chance to either keep in touch with friends from high school, or I moved to a new city and it was a way to meet new people, just kind of joining a fantasy league that way. So it sort of shocked me. But then I've seen it just continue to grow and grow. And I think what really lit a fire under it was probably the pandemic, because you had a lot of people who, sadly either lost their jobs or were working a lot less. They were all stuck at home. And for better or worse, a lot of people said, you know what? I'm going to start a podcast, because why not? You're at home. You've got the time. You can go on Amazon and get all the stuff, get a mic, get a, whatever that you need. And so that grew, I think, the space even faster than it already was. But I've also seen it grow in terms of sort of how we look at it and how we analyze it. And I think that sort of comes from having so many more voices and more different people there, because now it really is a year-round thing. When I started, we were essentially a July to January sort of proposition. And then we kind of go into hibernation, and maybe we'd write our draft kit or whatever. That would take a few months, but it was kind of slow going. But now, once the actual fantasy season is over, then it turns into draft season. And those two things really go hand in hand. So a lot of people are now start talking about the college prospects and where they might go and what this could mean for fantasy. And you've got dynasty leagues that they really kick up the trade engine. I mean, you are familiar with the hot stove. It's dynasty football from like February to, maybe March, probably about May or June. That's the fantasy football equivalent of the hot stove, where people are trying to make trades and figure out what rookies are really going to pop this year. So it has grown into literally a year-round industry that has spawned, I think, sub-industries when you talk about the sports betting and the DFS and the drafting and the scouting and all that kind of stuff. It really has become its own entity in itself. It's amazing. I say that I have to keep studying. I have to keep learning, because there are so many people doing so many good things that you can't really just rest on what you've always done if you're going to stay relevant, because somebody else is coming along with something else new and interesting. And even if you're not doing that thing, you have to learn how to understand and explain that thing for the people out there who are following your content.
Absolutely. And even from the analyzing perspective, what have you noticed has changed? Because I think of prospects and how you're looking at them, and we cannot predict the future. And covering the Oakland A's, they're all highly touted prospects, and a lot of times they don't pan out. So when you're analyzing those guys, how has that changed over the years?
Well, first off, I want you to clip that part that says, about predicting the future, because that's what I try to tell people when things I say go wrong. Like, predicting the future is hard. It really is. I think what has happened is because now we have this marriage, and it's not just in football, I think it's across all sports, of the analytics versus watching the film. And I think, to do it well, you have to be able to sort of do both. So, I sit and I'm not a tape grinder myself, but I follow a lot of people who are. I watch them. Look, our friend Matt Harmon has done a great job with his own reception perception, where he watches film on wide receivers and tells you what he thinks. And a lot of times what he says turns out to actually have a lot of merit. But there are just as many people who are looking at athletic testing and what this means in terms of their potential to succeed at the next level. And I think there's a lot more of that now, where we are really breaking down prospects on a different level than we were. Where before, I think, it used to just be, hey man, this guy was really good in college, or this guy won the Heisman Trophy, like he's going to be a star. And now it's more about like, hey, look, this guy tested well, or he didn't test well, or he was in an offense that featured him. He was in an offense that didn't feature his strengths. And now he's going to a place where maybe he's a good fit, maybe he's a bad fit. I think there's a more holistic approach to sort of scouting guys. That doesn't mean we get them all right? I mean, I look at a guy like Puka Nacua, where, if you dig far enough, you can find a couple of people who said Puka Nacua would be good. I don't think anybody expected that this guy from BYU, who barely got on the field, who nobody really talked about, who was, a 5th or 6th round pick, most people wouldn't have been able to tell you that he was going to be the star that he was in the early part of the season. So we get some wrong, but then, every once in a while, you look around and, like a guy like Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase, right? They come out and they have amazing rookie seasons. Like, we can all go around and say, like, yeah, we saw that one coming.
Totally.
So I think we've gotten better about it, but we're still not perfect.
You can predict the future once the future's done, right?
Absolutely.
And I envy people like Matt Harmon who could watch tape. I wish I could do that. I just can't. But let's talk a little bit about that when it comes to, I think of Kurt Warner, right? And he openly went on Twitter and talked about Brock Purdy, and Kurt Warner's from a different era where analytics were certainly there. You have to talk about that when you're making your Hall of Fame cases and what have you. But he also pointed out the fact that he saw something that the numbers aren't showing. And we talk about how Purdy's been, prior to this Iowa farming situation, he was struggling. So we know the numbers reflect that. So how about analyzing that from that perspective? Because you share the stage or, the studio with pros before. Are they embracing the new analytics, or just, I'm not saying there's a bunch of new analytics, but there's still a field there. They played the game. Are we finding a balance?
I think there's a balance there. And I think a good example, I talked to Steve Smith Sr., who is equal parts.
Best name drop I've ever had ever.
Thanks, man.
That's
I appreciate that.
So good.
But he is equal parts entertaining and informative, and he does understand that part of it, right? But I had a conversation with him the other day, and he's like, look, it's great to look at some of these metrics and say, like, hey, this guy gets open X% of the time, or he gets this much separation from defenders. But Steve also is like, look, I get to go to these practices and I get to watch guys, and sometimes it is just about the eye test and what you see. And hey, look, maybe a guy is great in practice, right? That every day in practice, he's going out there and killing it. But you also got to keep in mind that he's practicing against the same guys every day. And at some point, it's like, he's like, they practice together. They sit and eat lunch together. He's like, I know you. I know how you're going to react to things. I know what you're going to do on the field. And so maybe I look great against you because I know what you're doing every day, versus when we go out and play another team and I'm not as familiar with their defensive players, am I going to be able to get open the same way? And I think there is that, understanding that the analytics and the numbers do have some merit to them. But I think for a lot of guys who played, there is just something about watching a guy and knowing that player just has an unknown quantity about them. I mean, look, maybe the best example, right? Tom Brady, famously a 6th round pick, a guy who was good at Michigan, but there was nothing about his college career that suggested he was going to be the greatest quarterback of all time. But it was just a thing about him, whether it was, a little bit of a physical ability, maybe a mental difference that he had over other players, and maybe a little bit of just a good situation that he landed in New England. There were no analytics that told us Tom Brady was going to become, Tom Brady as we know him now.
And I'm glad you kind of mentioned Tom Brady, and you're talking about like the greatest of all time. Do we drop that term too quickly?
Yes, 100%.
But Tom Brady, we're not dropping that quickly. There's stuff to back it, but I'm guilty of it too. I do it from a broadcasting perspective, but what are your thoughts on dropping the GOAT term?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we do. Although I will say this, I think most of the time when you hear people say it, it's done ironically, right?
Totally.
I think when you have a guy who has like one huge game, right? You're like, oh, he's the GOAT, right? But I think most of us understand that that's done very much tongue in cheek. But I do think in a lot of ways we are prisoners of the moment, right? Where it sort of became a running joke, especially in football Twitter, where every year there's a prospect that comes out and you hear, oh, this guy's a generational talent. And it's like, well, we just had a generational talent like 2 years ago. Like generations don't flip over that quickly. Like, so I think sometimes we are sort of prisoners of the moment where something happens, whether it's, in a particular season or maybe it's a course of 5 years, and we forget about everything that came before it. I mean, I always joke that nothing exists on the internet before 2015. Like
Mhm.
anything that happened before 2015 might as well be the dark ages, according to the internet. So,
I said some stupid shit in 2014, so I'm glad it's not showing.
there you go.
14.
It's been scrubbed. It's been scrubbed from our collective memories. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I think we drop it a little bit too quickly. I also think that part of it is because we live now in an age where I don't know that embrace debate is the right term, but we do debate and rank and quantify everything sometimes without having a full knowledge of what a person's career is going to be. So I think we are too quick to do it, but I don't know. I don't think
I'm not
anything's
going to
going to
stop
change.
dropping it.
Like nothing's going to change,
I
right?
met people who are GOATs, and I wouldn't even think of the numbers that they've done. And
Mhm.
you and I were talking about before we pressed record. Stephen Vogt is one of the GOATs that I've ever covered as far as an interview goes, and that's where my mind goes, right?
Mhm.
And so it's always kind of interesting to talk about that. And I'm glad you mentioned like generational talent, because when it comes to football, obviously I'm a baseball girl. I know you're a baseball guy. We think of eras of the game. So when you think of that, are there different eras where perhaps certain players wouldn't be up to a certain level of the game? Because I think we think of like, oh, could Babe Ruth really hit off of a Shohei Ohtani? Could he
Right.
do anything against Spencer Strider? Those types of things. Is that the case when it comes to football in different eras of the game?
I think there are. Yeah, I definitely think there are. I go back, the first name that comes to mind is a Joe Namath, right? Because he's a Hall of Famer. But you go back and you look at his numbers, and they weren't great. I mean, some of it was because of the era, right? Because that time teams relied more on running backs. They didn't throw the football nearly as much. But I don't know that a guy like Joe Namath or that even maybe a Terry Bradshaw, like you look at their numbers statistically, they weren't great. I mean, I think of the 1972 Dolphins, who they're the last team to go through a season undefeated, and their surviving members pop champagne every time the last team in the NFL suffers its first loss. But they weren't a great team, right? And I think there are some guys that can play in any era, right? I mean, I think you look across, I think a guy like I don't know, Terrell Owens pops into mind, right? I mean, it's a big, strong, physical guy with speed. I think he plays in any era. I think Jim Brown, who
Yeah.
passed away recently, he's a guy who succeeds in pretty much any era. So I think that happens. I also think, though, an underrated part of this conversation is, and I think about it especially with basketball, but I think football applies too, right? If you take those guys from a previous generation and you give them all the same training methods and the
We have
dietary information and that sort of thing, I think there are a lot more of them that could succeed nowadays than maybe we give credit for. I mean, I think there's a baseline athletic ability that is enhanced because we just know so much more scientifically about how the human body works and about strategy. So I do think that maybe there are more guys that could cross over eras than we're willing to give credit for.
And I'm obviously going to reference baseball again, because if a guy's doing well, we automatically assume PEDs, right? But we're not looking at Shohei Ohtani chugging beer and eating hot dogs 24/7. And it's the same thing. Like the diet is important, which is why you just see a lot of these guys elongating their careers, which is a whole thing that we don't talk about. And on that note, like I think of Keenan Allen, right? And how unheard of it is to have a career of that magnitude. And I'm just talking being able to continuously play. And how rare is that for a guy of his age, of his durability, to not only play for a long time, but do it up to the par that he's doing?
I mean, I think it's rare, more rare than we think. And I think what happens is we see a guy like Keenan Allen, who's been in the league as long as he has, and has been successful for as long as he has. And we forget that the average NFL career is 3 years, right? So what that means is that for everybody like a Keenan Allen, right, who's been in the league for a decade or more, there are many, many, many more guys whose careers are done after a year or two. I mean, you think about the Tom Brady's and Brett Favre's of the world who play for nearly 20 years. That sort of skews the average in one direction versus the guys who, they show up and they get maybe a season and you never hear from them again. I mean, I think it's, it's one of the truisms about watching Hard Knocks where, they always do the thing at the end where, a lot of guys are getting cut.
Yeah.
And for a lot of guys, that's the last time you're ever going to play organized football. That you started probably in Pop Warner and you went through high school and college and you got a shot with an NFL team and then you get cut and then the phone stops ringing, and I think that is a realization that I think we all know intellectually, but I don't think we really pay attention to, right? So we look at a guy that has an 8-10 year career and we're like, yeah, that's amazing. But I don't think we realize how amazing it is in the context of all the guys who show up at training camp and whose names we never learn and who we never hear from again because they don't make a roster, or if they do, they're barely hanging on and they're not on the field on Sundays generally. There way more, many more of those guys than the guys whose names we know.
And, on that note, obviously in a fantasy world, you are kind of looking at these guys as numbers. So what are your emotions when you think of like a guy as a guy, when you have to analyze them as what they're producing on the field? How do you kind of separate that? Because I know you personally, I know you're not just screw this guy as a person, whatever. Right. How do you separate that? Because that's difficult. I hated that part of the fantasy life.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? And I think the thing we sort of have to say is, I mean, it sort of sounds trite, right? But a guy gets hurt. Look, Kirk Cousins tears his Achilles, or Daniel Jones
ruined my
tears his
fantasy
ACL.
team.
Hey, man, look, I have a team that has Aaron Rodgers, Anthony Richardson, and Kirk Cousins. I've lost 3 quarterbacks on one roster in a season. And so but the human side of you is like, yeah, man, this sucks, right? Kirk Cousins, this is his life. This is his career. He has put so much emotion into this. And so to have that taken away from a human standpoint, it does suck. But I think you sort of learn to compartmentalize in the sense of injuries are a part of the game. No matter what sport you play, injuries are a part of the game. And, especially in football, they always like to say next man up because, Kirk Cousins is hurt. The Vikings don't get to just stop playing, right? They don't get to postpone games until Kirk's ready to go. They got to find somebody to move in there. And so I think for, when we come to analyze it, you try to have that sympathy of like, hey, man, Kirk, best of luck, man. I hope you heal up. Want to see you back out there soon. But also realizing that the Vikings have another game, that fantasy folks, they've got to figure out what to do. And so you sort of try to balance.
And they're depending on you too for that, which is crazy.
Yeah, and I'll say this. I have an easier time doing it with injuries because injuries are a part of the game, right?
Yeah.
Like you understand, especially in a sport that's as violent as football, you understand that that's going to happen as much as it sucks. The ones that are harder for me are the ones involving, off-field things, right? When you have players that are suspended for domestic violence or, just really awful things off the field, that's one that's a little bit harder because those are real life things that don't have anything to do with football. Daniel Jones getting hurt, it's unfortunate, but it's a part of the game. But somebody who's suspended because they got in a domestic violence dispute with a spouse or a partner, and you're reading the stories about what may have happened, or you're seeing photos of the aftermath of that sort of thing. Those are the ones that are harder for me. When a guy gets suspended and immediately there's people in my Twitter mentions saying, so who do I go pick up now? And I'm just like, yeah, that's one I've never really gotten over. That always makes me a little bit queasy. I tend to either I will take a beat before I make any sort of comment, or depending if it's bad enough, That might just be, hey, you're on your own to kind of figure this one out because I just don't feel comfortable talking about it.
Good for you. And I'm very proud of you for doing that. Last couple before I let you go, the tight end position has certainly blossomed over the years. And it's great to see that they're getting the monetary value that they deserve just as far as the contractual obligations are concerned. But what is it from a fantasy perspective that you've noticed over the years and all the production you're getting out of that position?
So I'll say this, this year has been maybe the best tight end year in a while. And I think the last few weeks, especially because we're starting to get a lot of younger players at the tight end position. There's a number of rookies who are playing well. Sam Laporta for the Detroit Lions, Dalton Kincaid with the Buffalo Bills playing well, which is great because I think the running joke across fantasy used to be, every year in August, we get together and we're like, hey, man, the tight end position is going to be a lot deeper in fantasy this year. And then we get to the 1st of October, like, tight end sucks. What were we thinking? This year has been a little bit different in that, I think this year we came into the season saying, hey, look, man, tight end is what it is. Try to get you one early. Hope that it's, hope you get a Travis Kelce or a TJ Hawkinson and hope that guy works out and stays healthy. But this year we've been able to supplement, where, as I mentioned, Kincaid, Laporta, Jake Ferguson with the Dallas Cowboys really starting to blossom. So we're adding some depth to the position that we haven't had in a while. It's still maybe one of the thinner positions across fantasy, but I think it's less bleak at tight end now than it was, maybe the last couple of years. So hopefully that's good things, right? Hopefully this is the beginning of a positive cycle at the position. And I'm glad to see any guys get paid, right? So I think our next job is to figure out how to get running backs paid because they're the ones who I think they take a lot of the physical punishment and they're not getting a lot of the rewards. And I know, look, this goes back to analytics, and I'm off on a tangent here, but I know, like, the analytics say that it doesn't make sense to pay a running back, and I'm like, look, man, these guys take a beating. They're asked to do so much. Their lifespan in the NFL is so much shorter than everybody else's. I think we reward the guys who are good at what they do, and we figure out the rest of it there because, I think also in the long run, if we're not rewarding those guys for playing that demanding position, we're just not going to have talent at that position. And, to not have guys as talented or as fun to watch as, say, Saquon Barkley or Christian McCaffrey, I think it'd be a shame in the long run. And I think we would all lose out as football fans.
And it's actually been kind of cool to watch these contracts given out because up until recently, I was like, oh, these are nothing compared to baseball contracts.
No, they are.
These Mahomes and Burrow contracts are like, I'm kind of blushing. This is like Bryce Harper money. Let's go. So that's good to see too. Because just from my perspective in covering baseball, I feel like football is such a more demanding physical sport and they absolutely deserve all of this. Before I let you go, there's this one, I don't know if you call it a meme or a photo that you always put on Twitter, and it's a sticky note and it's no matter what. Yes. So who is your guy this week for your no matter what sticky?
Ooh, my no matter what sticky this week. Hang on, let me scroll through the schedule. I think right now it's probably, you know what? I'm gonna go back to the Bay Area, right? I'm gonna go Jared Goff. Coming up this week in week 10, going against the Chargers, the guy from Marin, the guy who went to Cal, the Chargers secondary, the Chargers defense has been sort of shaky. Goff and the Lions have been fun, man. And look, I've got friends from Detroit who are Lions fans, and I'm happy for them, man, because they have struggled through some bad football for a good portion of their lives. So the fact that the Lions are good, they look like they can win the division and maybe win a playoff game or two, I'm excited for them. But from a fantasy perspective, Goff and that Lions offense has been playing well. The Charger defense has been a little bit suspect this year, and that could be a very high-scoring game. So my no matter what guy this week in fantasy is going to be Jared Goff.
I used to have a friend who went to Marin Catholic, and no matter where we were at, she's like, I went to the same school as Jared Goff. I'm like, we know. We know you did. Like 2 vodka crayons deep, and we're just going off about Goff. And it's like, nobody. I'm like, she's going to, there she goes. So
There it is. Here it comes. That train is never late.
It never got us free drinks, though. So maybe next time, just like, don't mention it. Thanks, Marcus, so much for your time.
Appreciate it.
That was my chat with Marcas Grant of NFL Network. And just for me personally, who I'm actually taking the year off from fantasy football. It was an accident. Baseball took over my life. And You think you have friends and then they start a league without you, but that's okay. Some of us have a lot of responsibilities. We don't have time to do a fantasy league. I literally forgot, you guys. I totally missed the boat on it. And that's okay because life happens. But like I said, and just like Marcus mentioned, everybody's a fantasy football expert. We all know the right drafts to do. And not to mention Marcas Grant, when he did his first NFL or his first fantasy football draft, he drafted Dan Marino. Yeah, Dan Marino. So obviously things have come a long way. The tight end position is certainly growing like we talked about. And it's good to see these guys get the monetary value they deserve. Hopefully it trickles down to the running back position because let's face it, those guys put in a lot of work during such a short time span for a career. It's crazy to think about. I mean, obviously I have a baseball background and 3 years in the league. That's pretty standard across multiple sports. It's one thing I hear about in every single league. It's one thing to get there. It's way more difficult to stay. So it's interesting to get that point of view. I'm always curious. And can we just agree the combine is kind of a weird deal? I'll have to dig into that. Maybe I'll get a guest for that because you're just watching dudes work out and run and you're taking notes about it. And a pretty empty stadium too, nonetheless. Anyways, thanks for tuning in to Short and to the Point. As always, follow all of our work on the Comeback and Awful Announcing. And follow us on YouTube. Just search Awful Announcing and you'll find this podcast as well as our Awful Announcing podcast and keeping up to date with everything going on. As always, Producer Philip, thanks for putting up with my everything. I have very much appreciated. Jessica Kleinschmidt here, and we will see you next time.
Want even more short and to the point? Follow Jessica at KleinschmidtJD and head over to thecomeback.com and awfulannouncing.com.